Now that we've got a better understanding of where our motion originates from and how to facilitate these strokes, we can begin adding a little bit more structure to our double strokes. The first way we're going to do that is with one of my favorite exercises for teaching and learning these strokes, which is by playing some endless dedups with our wrist. So dedups, and in this case endless dedups, are groupings of double strokes which sound da-dup, 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 da-dup. And the reason that I call them endless dedups is because we haven't quite structured or put a meter or time signature to what we're playing yet. So later on we'll play 8 dedups and we'll just cycle this on 8 times or however many times you need to. But for right now we're going to be playing endless dedups on one hand using our wrist. So some things to watch out for before starting this is to make sure that the second stroke that we play is just as powerful, if not more powerful, than the first stroke. We want to make sure that the first note is not being favored in terms of volume or power or anything like that, and we end up with uneven double strokes. We want to make sure that these are as close to the same as possible, and for practicing purposes, to actually bring out that second double stroke, so the second stroke in the double, the da-dup, the dup, da-dup, 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 can actually be quite beneficial because later on as we go to speed these up, the first stroke in the double strokes will naturally kind of carry a little bit more weight to it. So we want to make sure that they're not getting off balance in that way. And I can assure you that as you speed these up, you don't have to worry about your second stroke being too strong compared to the first stroke. We want these to sound as even as possible when we speed them up. So by emphasizing the second note now, we are putting ourselves at a great advantage in the future. So let's try some endless dedups with wrist strokes on one hand. Da-dup, da-dup, da-ready, go, da-dup, 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 da-dup. While you're doing these, it's not super necessary that you aim for the tallest stick heights possible. Even in demonstrating this, I think probably my second strokes were a little bit taller than you need to. The dup of the dup, I don't think they even need to necessarily be that tall. And just to reference and make sure that you are playing wrist strokes, remember we can do our reverse grip strokes like this and make sure that the wrist is facilitating most of that motion. For these strokes, we don't necessarily need much finger action happening as far as facilitating any more of that motion. We'll start to add in the finger later. Once you feel comfortable on one hand, or maybe you're a stronger hand, move on to the other hand and do the same thing. And after having worked up the other hand, what you can do is play both hands together, which is really helpful. Of course, practicing in a mirror and video practice, like we've talked about in the past, is very beneficial and very important, especially now that we're working on double stroke things. It can really help to make sure that the heights are lining up and that one hand isn't being favored in terms of volume, stick height, anything like that. So you can play both hands together in this da-dup exercise. Da-dup, da-dup, with wrist strokes go. Da-dup, 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 da-dup. And so that is a really good way for beginning to put some more structure into these double strokes with our first type of double, which is the wrist double, which will be used for slower speed double strokes, where maybe the speed isn't quite fast enough because of the sort of the balance necessary to play with finger double strokes or the drop catch, open close double strokes. Those sort of have their own tempo range that they exist in, and right now we are sort of over here in the slower speed with the wrist doubles, and of course there's some overlap, but the open close or the drop catch doubles sort of exist here. And then later on at the far edge, we will use fully just bounced doubles. So with that in mind, let's try speeding these up a little bit and start using our drop catch doubles. So with drop catch doubles, what we will do is actually start using a little bit more of this finger as we have spoken about in the past. So what makes these sort of special is that the fingers are going to come in to sort of close up the last part of the double stroke. So we're going to do this in super slow motion with really big overemphasized motions while we're doing this to get the idea, and then we will streamline and refine them down to make them actually usable for our double strokes. So the open close or the drop catch doubles consist firstly of a wrist stroke. So the wrist will be facilitating the first stroke. And what makes these different from our just regular wrist doubles is that our back fingers are going to kick out after the first stroke. So if you imagine the first stroke is played, and this will happen a lot faster when you're actually putting these into practice. The first stroke will be played with the wrist stroke, and as the stick rebounds from the first stroke, I'm resetting here, as the stick rebounds, these back fingers will kick out to allow the stick to rotate around the fulcrum. So if we think of playing wrist doubles, look where the pivot is happening. It's all happening in the wrist. This is where our fulcrum is. In playing drop catch doubles, we have first a fulcrum here with the first stroke where the full stick is rotating around. Our full body, our full machine here is rotating around here at the wrist. Then, as the stick hits, we are really moving our fulcrum up to here. And by doing so, we need to kick these fingers out to facilitate this motion. So what you really need to do is get comfortable with this first part of the motion. This is, now that we're starting to combine more of these techniques together, this can be a little bit difficult to kind of start to wrap your head around. But by doing these one motion at a time and by doing them very slowly, you can really get a sense of what's going on. And it will take time to build this up and to build these techniques up. But it's super important that you go slowly and just do it properly from the very beginning rather than having to reteach yourself or relearn after having developed bad habits. So the first part, again, we are starting with a wrist stroke. The stick will naturally want to bounce back because of physics things. And then in order to facilitate the bounce back, we're going to kick those back fingers out like so. So that's the first part of the drop catch double. And again, as we speed this up, this motion isn't going to be quite as drastic as it is now. I'm kind of overdoing it to show you and to demonstrate what's going on with these motions. The second part, which we can kind of just start here with the stick in prep for part two. So if you imagine I just played the first part of the stroke, this is part one of the stroke. Part two of the stroke is to simply close the fingers. And by closing the fingers, we've now created a new propulsion system. Remember, we talked about our propulsion systems when playing on the back side of our hand here. Now our propulsion system are the back fingers. So we can start in part two here. So we've got part one, and then part two is to simply squeeze the stick shut. And if you need to use two hands to kind of reset, by all means, feel free to do that. So we've got just squeezing the stick to propel it forward around this new fulcrum. And you can do it a little bit more powerfully as it becomes more comfortable, but definitely don't do it to the point where you're causing yourself any pain, or if you notice that the stick is kind of flying all over the place or it's not traveling in straight lines while you're trying to do this. Just get the motion at first, right? Do it slowly. And if you notice, my wrist is not having really anything to do with this second part of the motion. What gets this a little bit hard to explain, and especially if you haven't really focused on your bodily awareness and function yet, a lot of times when I have seen students try to do this, they just cannot wrap around their heads that the fulcrum is here and the fingers are moving the stick. The fingers are moving the stick. If you look and you notice that you're doing this, and the wrist is starting to turn and collapse, then we've got two fulcrums happening. We only want one for this second part of the double stroke. Right? And as you do this in slow motion, these are going to be pretty weak close strokes, right, for the open close. But the more comfortable you get, again, and as you speed this up, they get a little bit more powerful. And you can kind of hear now that can begin to stand on its own as a stroke within the double stroke. So once you've practiced that and have a good understanding and a good feeling for both parts of the stroke, which again, part one is the wrist stroke, where the back fingers will open or the stick will be dropped. Okay, part one. And then we have part two, which is to close the stick shut with our back fingers only. And you can see on those second strokes, the wrist is not moving. The wrist has done its job by propelling the stick forward. So what we can do now is speed up the tempo a little bit to get into the tempo range for our drop catch doubles and play more endless dedups on one hand. So we can go da-dup, da-dup, da, ready, go. As you're developing this technique for double strokes, try not to push the tempo too much. So I know that I said that these sort of exist in their own tempo ranges, but try to stay on the edge as slowly as you can. Again, this is a little bit difficult to do just because of the sort of the physics required to make these motions happen. These are kind of difficult to do at a very slow tempo, but try to stay on the edge of where it sort of is and isn't happening so that you're not pushing yourself too far and again creating some of those bad and sloppy techniques for playing just because it was sort of difficult not to play too slowly. Does that make sense? And once you have a comfortable grasp of the endless dedups, what we can do is, again, add some further structure to it. So let's now play the 8 dedups exercise, which will begin incorporating both hands, working one at a time, but again, it's a little more structured. And we can play these at a slow tempo with wrist strokes. A 1, a 2, dedup, a go. For anybody using this sort of resource in a group, for a large group of people, if you're going to have your snares and your tenors and your bass drums playing together, it's very important that you start from a low dynamic level. When we learn these with the drum lines that I've worked with, I typically tell them to start with piano strokes, 3-inch strokes, just to sort of get the motion because if you're coming at these with like 9 or 12-inch strokes, it's very difficult to match them across the drum line. So we need to learn these and get the motions down before starting to go for power and volume and things like that, because it can really get sloppy very quickly if everybody's trying to muscle and force these out when they're not quite ready to and they haven't adapted to matching stroke types and dynamics with one another. So what I would encourage you to do is sort of find the edge of where you can play these double strokes and mark down the BPM at which the edge occurs, sort of, right? So wrist stroke doubles don't really have a bottom speed because they're the least technically demanding, as long as you don't die or break any bones in between the two strokes. You can always play that second stroke at some point. So finding the bottom edge of the tempo range for wrist strokes is not that difficult to do. So what you need to do is sort of find your top end and see how these two techniques will blend together with one another, and the two techniques being the wrist double and the drop catch. So what you can do is sort of push yourself and do this with a metronome and find out at what speed can you just physically not play your wrist doubles anymore. So that would be maybe a good, probably 10, 15 BPM off of that would be a good place to reference that, and to say, okay, no more, no more, no more. Because at that speed for me, then they start to become shatum, 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 shatum. And you can check to see whether you're playing wrist stroke doubles, or if you're not sure, maybe you think, oh, am I actually incorporating a little finger? What you can do is actually start doing some ham boning.
Ham boning.
What? No, man, stop it!
And to make sure that you are playing your actual double strokes, because it's very difficult to play double strokes while ham boning with your fingers. So you can start playing double strokes like this, and they should come out sounding sort of like actual double strokes. And again, and also that obviously applies to just the dedup exercise. So if there's ever any question of, is that coming out as a wrist, or am I incorporating a little bit of finger into that? That's a great way to check, just sort of as a funny aside. So once you figured that out, mark down that tempo, whatever that BPM was, and then maybe again, kick a little bit off of the tempo so that you can make the transition in between the two techniques, and then try the drop catch or the open close double stroke with 8 dedups at that tempo. The next exercise that we're going to look at is just a simple double beat exercise, the sort of the Mortal Kombat rhythm, the dun 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 dun. And so what we're going to do is play that rhythm on one hand, and again, while you're doing this, you would want to start with the wrist double stroke technique and play that, and this will really help to develop your double strokes with a little bit more fun and structure to the rhythm that you're playing. And as you go through, of course, the tempo ranges and start speeding it up, see at what BPM do you need to play the open close or the drop catch doubles. And you can sort of see where this is going now, right? So we are doing these exercises to get our single hand double strokes worked up to the point that when we go to put them together in roll combinations, or to play drags, or just some diddled passages with 16th notes or anything like that, that we have the physical and technical facilities to be able to do that. or faculties. So we are going to check that by moving on to our next exercise, which is going to be working on the griddle or the diddle grid or the double stroke grid. And again, we're just going to take the simplest part of this, the first line, to make sure that our double strokes are happening the way that we want them to across both of our hands. So let's start with a nice, easygoing, very, very, very slow double stroke grid, and just check these and sort of reference that we have the general idea and the right idea for counting, and then I'll play it at a bit of a faster tempo using the drop catch double. So we'll start 1E and 2E and 3E and 4E, ready, go. While you're working on these, it's very important that you don't start to overemphasize your double strokes and add more weight to them than what is needed. For some reason, there's this habit that I've noticed and that I, personally partake in myself, to start accenting things where they don't have accents. Now, you may have heard again that the second stroke of the double was a little bit accented, and that's again to demonstrate, to place that weight on that second stroke so that as we speed it up, it's not getting left in the dust as far as the weight on that second note is concerned. But for the most part, the first strokes of the double, right, the first of the 1, 2, da-da, 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 the da stroke should be at the same stick height as the rest of the strokes. So practice that using the wrist stroke techniques, going through the various tempos as you practice it, bump it up by 2 or 4 BPM every single time in between as you feel comfortable speeding it up if that's what you're working on. Don't go super crazy with it. And then once you figure out, okay, this feels about as fast as I can play it with wrist double strokes, then start moving on to the drop catch doubles, which you should have a good grasp on after having practiced either infinite dedups or 8 dedups using drop catch, or you could use your Mortal Kombat double beat as well. So here is the griddle using drop catch doubles a little bit faster. 1E and 2E and a griddle with drop catch and go. And if you find that while you're working on the griddle or the double stroke grid, the diddle grid, that it sounds right, but maybe it's just a little bit inconsistent. What you can do is add check patterns in between. So we start with a check pattern to get the motion going, right? So we start with 1E and 2E and start the exercise, go. And then we start the exercise. What you can do is actually place those check patterns in between the entire grid passages and get that going. So I'll play a little bit faster now, the double stroke grid with check pattern 16th notes in between each measure. So here we go, 1E and a 2E and a grid with checks, go. And sort of what I'll do here is to sort of demonstrate that even though our double strokes have sped up pretty immensely over the course of just these few exercises, that I'm still using the drop catch release. And this, I think, is a pretty good tempo range to demonstrate just how viable the drop catch is. I think you could still go even a little bit faster with these before you have to switch to purely bounced double strokes. And they do also work at taller stick heights as well. So what I'll do now is include a zoomed in shot of my hands and maybe even play a little bit of it in slow motion so that you can see just really the mechanics of what's going on in the hands while working on this. So hopefully this has helped you a little bit in developing your double strokes. I know that speeding up double strokes can be one of the most difficult things to sort of wrap your head around. It really does just take a lot of dedicated and focused practice, and to be honest, it's quite boring practice. Working on these is not like super fun by any means, because it's a lot of you see your end goal and it feels so far away, but slowly over time you will find that these things start to get cleaned up. They start to sound a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better, and before you know it, your double strokes are not perfect, but are hopefully to the point where you're a little bit happier with them.